Is my screen visible? Good to go. Okay, so thank you again so much for being here. Today we are going to be talking about measuring learning outcomes. Because this lab is focused on foundational literacy and numeracy, we know that this is something that is a really core part of all of your work. And so we wanted to create some space to share a little bit about the monitoring requirements for the lab, as well as to create space for you to ask questions and learn from each other's experience in this area. We know there's a lot of expertise in the room, and so we'll have some time for you to work within your teams, but as well as across teams to share some of those ideas. So the topics that we're going to cover today is defining foundational learning, why we'd want to assess it, what makes assessments valid and reliable. Then we'll talk about some different types of assessment tools, how to choose or develop them, as well as how to interpret and communicate your results. And we'll finish with a worksheet that's going to let us know how you're planning on reporting learning outcomes for monitoring for the labs, and then just end with some additional reflection time. As we're going, I want to make sure that we have enough time in the breakout room. So if you have any questions, just feel free to drop them in the chat. And then when we get to some stopping points, we can refer back to those. But do feel free to put those questions in the chat as we go. So first, we just want to start by defining what we mean by foundational learning and check in to see if your definitions are similar or if you have any different ways of looking at what foundational learning means in your organization. The definition from the World Bank Group is that it includes basic literacy, numeracy, as well as transferable skills. And people include a lot of different things under this category of transferable skills. Sometimes it's social emotional learning, sometimes it's other things. But because the focus of the lab is foundational literacy and numeracy, today we're really just focusing on those first two areas of foundational learning. And one framework that we think is helpful when thinking about foundational learning is the Global Proficiency Framework, which provides kind of an international way to categorize different areas and highlight key areas that relate to reading and to math. So for grades 2 and 3 for reading in the Global Proficiency Framework, some of the categories are oral language comprehension, which includes retrieving information, decoding, which includes both precision, which is their word for accuracy, as well as fluency, and then reading comprehension, which includes both retrieving and interpreting information. Similarly for math, there are a few big buckets as well as some sub-skills under that. So the first one is number knowledge, which includes whole numbers, fractions, operations, as well as real-world problems. And then there are 4 other buckets of content as well: measurement, statistics and probability, geometry, and algebra. So a lot of foundational numeracy content tends to focus on number knowledge, but according to this framework, there are some additional areas that fall under the category of foundational learning. So I'll stop sharing my screen in just a second and we can share out or share in the chat, but just take a second to think about the resources and activities that you included in your theory of change, because that really gets at what your organization is doing, what your solution is doing, and just reflect on, do those components connect to the Global Proficiency Framework either directly or indirectly? Or are there any other frameworks that you use within your organization to define foundational literacy or numeracy? And these are the categories that are in the Global Proficiency Framework. So I'll just put that in the chat, and then feel free to let us know if this is the framework you use or if you use something a little bit different. Maybe we can go in alphabetical order. Does anyone from Angaza want to let us know, is this similar to the definition you use or is it different?
Yeah, I can pick that, Sarah. So we do use DPF for our numeracy work, but up to until last year when we were doing some work on science of teaching, then we advised that GPF doesn't work for numeracy, especially when we are dealing with learners whose English is not their first language. So really looking at other frameworks like WIDA, that really focus on learners whom they have to first start with mother tongue and then translate into English when they're learning about literacy. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Does someone from Axiom want to talk about how you define foundational literacy?
I mean, I think this is pretty well aligned to our how we think about literacy. We're not. I think the challenge for us is we haven't found a very good way of measuring that that interpretation piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and great point, Simon. Writing isn't very well reflected in that framework. Anyone from Dwara?
Yeah, broadly feels aligned. I mean, so far we're working with partners who are aligning themselves to the UK standards, which I assume are aligned with that. But I actually right now don't have done that cross-checking. But in terms of what I see on the screen, those are part of our assessments.
Anyone else? That's fine. So I just wanted to bring it up.
So I was just gonna, sorry for being a hesitator. I was just gonna add that there's no acknowledgement of oral language in here. And it's like, if some people might say that comprehension is oral language combined with decoding or word recognition. And so it seems like a gap, and it means that there's a flaw in the assessment where a child that can read and speak, like my 3-year-old can read and speak, but doesn't have literacy skills, but would appear to have the same level of literacy as my dog, according to this criteria.
Right. For reading, it includes oral language comprehension, retrieving information, but it doesn't say anything about expressive language. It's a good point. And we just wanted to start with this to bring up the fact that any kind of assessment you use is going to be aligned to whatever your view is of foundational learning. So whether that is 100% aligned with the global proficiency framework, or if you have a rationale for a different kind of framework, that's really going to set the foundation for what you think is important to measure when it comes to these areas. So thank you again for sharing some of your definitions.
Sarah, can I ask you not to share the screen just for a second?
Mm-hmm.
May I ask you guys to use emojis or reactions, whatever, with thumbs up or thumbs down when you're reflecting on the framework, how well, or reflecting on the framework you currently use, how well the framework that you use is aligned with your resources and activities in your theory of change. So if you think it's aligned, thumbs up. If you think it's not sure, you use different reaction. But I just wanted to reiterate, I have 1 thumbs up.
Yeah, maybe can I respond?
Of course, please do, Ramesh.
Okay, cool, yeah. So maybe our solution doesn't directly touch upon FLN. So means as an intervention, we look at whole school transformation, but FLN grades are included, of course, in that. But in our assessments, so we sort of, in math, most of the competencies which are listed, I mean, maybe except probability and statistics are covered. And in reading, I guess like it's yeah, maybe except decoding fluency, maybe everything else is covered in our assessments.
Mhm.
And we do not a pen pencil assessment. It's kind of an oral assessment we do in the FLN grades when we do our assessments.
Yep, thank you. I just want to stress out that the proficiency framework is there for you to reflect on different elements that goes into the foundational learning and reflect on your resources and activities for your intervention. It doesn't mean that it will completely fits your needs, and there may be others, as Kiko, you pointed out, it didn't really work for our context, and that's fine. There is no framework or theory or a model that will be describing everything you do. You always will have a variety, but what's important to think about is for you to have a clarity in terms of what you're intervening, what's in your resources and activities, how does it align with FLM, and then what you're measuring, that's what we will be talking about next. What you're measuring needs to be very much reflective of what you're intervening. So the key point is it's not the model above and beyond all that you need to use. It's the model as an example that covers the majority of elements that goes into foundational learning. It's not perfect. There may be other frameworks and models that fits better your context, fits better your solution and your intervention. Nevertheless, it's for you to reflect on, okay, that's how it's being seen. We're addressing most of those elements, but also we are very much focusing on writing or oral comprehension or expression. And hence, we also need to think about what solution or assessment tool can we use in order to cover all those things that we are intervening. I think that's kind of the point we really wanted to stress out, an opportunity for you to reflect on what you're intervening, how does it align with the key foundational elements of the foundational learning and literacy news. Okie dokie, I think I've labeled that point. Now I'm happy to move on into the workshop, into the next slides. Okay, so why is it important to measure it? I think I've kind of gave a good intro onto that. And next slide, please. And then there are 4 things, and we discussed them in previous workshops in focusing on the theory of change, on focusing on the MEL framework, and the learning outcomes when you created your theory of change. Above all, the most important thing you really wanted to do, and all of your theory of change, is stress the importance of the intervention you do for the learning outcomes, for the greater good of children. There are different variety of elements and aspects that you can focus on, but after all, whatever you do, especially as you scale, the thing we must not lose track of the learning outcomes of children. So there are 4 things that we may want to consider when we're assessing the learning outcomes. First of all, the screening, understanding the system diagnostic. Does children in our context actually learn well? And then understanding the benchmark. What does it mean well for our children, for this subset? And understanding are they on track compared to everyone else in the world or everyone else in the region, and so on. Then also focusing on what are the key needs. Now we know where they are. We know where their strengths and weaknesses. We know what average look like or what normal look like within our context. So how do we support them best, and what needs do they have? And finally, how do we make addressing those needs, and how do we make this in our intervention that we will achieve that one sentence theory of change, that we will achieve desired impact. So for screening, for benchmarking, for making the decisions addressing the learners' needs and teachers' needs, and of course for ensuring that we are making the right decisions as we innovating or scaling, or both. Next slide.
And just to add to that, you might use the same assessment tools for all of these different purposes. But for deciding how often are you going to give the assessment, who are you going to give the assessment to, really focusing in on your purpose is what's going to help you make informed decisions about that.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's talk about validity and reliability. First of all, what are those? For the most assessment frameworks we'll talk about, those are standardized, but if you are using any measurement assessment or the one you want to create yourself, or if you have one, you most likely reflected on those two things, validity and reliability. So validity is help us to reflect whether this assessment that you're using actually measure that it meant to measure, or that it claims to measure. Does it measure it accurately? And the reliability allow us to understand the consistency of the results. Is this tool allow us to gain consistently among different samples, within the same sample, within the same children, very consistent results. So in some cases, the children who didn't do really well, all of a sudden start to do really, really well 5 months later without any intervention. So we need the tool that makes sure, ensuring both accuracy and the consistency. Next slide. So the tools that are unreliable and not valid may look like this dots diagram. So your data and your findings only as good as your assessment tool. So if your tool is not reliable and not valid, it means that data will be all over the place and not repeatable because it wouldn't be consistent. And it actually will measure things that you may not be intervening, and very misrepresentative. The data that is not consistent but valid will be all over the place for the same children, but it will measure the same constructs. Data that are reliable will consistently measure the same thing again and again. But the problem is, if it's not valid, it will measure random things that isn't reflective of children's progress, or isn't reflective of your key outcomes, whether we're talking about learning outcomes or not. And then, of course, data that's reliable and valid tool that's reliable and valid will provide you the data that will be accurate, the data that consistent, measurement on measurement, year on year, for across different types of variety of users, learners, and children, and it will measure the constructs you wanted to measure in the first place. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so why validity matter and why reliability matter? So if we have data spread all over the place and it actually doesn't measure what's supposed to measure, then what's the point of that data? It doesn't help you to track the progress. Also, there are constructs that we are hoping to achieve, for example, generally comprehension or motivation, that is difficult to capture. And for the most parts, they would require, the data you will gather would be self-reported data as opposed to data that you objectively can gather. So for that, you will be using proxies, and those proxies need to be very, very accurate, and they need to provide you very, very reliable results, so you can make conclusions and extrapolations, ensuring that you're on track, you're investing your time and money, and as well as time and time, life, and resources of your stakeholders. So ensuring those two things are really very important in order to ensure that you have the best data possible. Okay, next slide. So there are different types of validity. The face and content validity is simply shows that these questions, the tasks being used and administered, are effectively what it says they are, and they are established by experts, and they are very, very closely aligned with what those constructs or tasks meant to measure. The construct and criterion is fairly similar in a way. It's also about representation of the key elements. For example, when we talked about global proficiency framework earlier, there are different constructs in it, and the constructs will be very well presented and accurately defined in the tools that you're using for the assessment. So the face validity just simply explains or demonstrates that test is measuring intended skills and knowledge, and the content validity is the degree to which the test items represented all facets and domains of the measured construct. Next. Okay. So in terms of the construct validity, we want our assessment tool correlate and relate to the similar constructs that are there. So for example, if we are using the new tool, we want, and when we're piloting a new tool, we very often want hand in hand use another tool that's been established in the field that measuring similar sort of construct and measuring similar sort of thing, and have a strong relationship between those two. If we have the strong relationship with another construct, we have a problem. So we want to ensure that the tool measuring the similar constructs and as holistically as possible that construct, and not related to anything else, not to any other construct. So for example, when we're doing the written math test and scores highly correlate with the reading test, we're okay. However, if we notice that if math test is correlating with reading test, that's problematic. If reading test is closely correlated with the writing test, we're okay. The constructs could be quite similar because they're measuring generally language. And in context of the criterion validity, it's really important to understand the degree to which test correlates with an external well-established measures. So for example, we can use another gold standard, or we can use the another benchmarking that allows us to align and ensure that this measure that we have very closely align with the golden standard in the field. And it's also help us to, it has the properties in order to predict what will happen sometime later. So, okay, yeah, thank you. No, it's okay. So, validity is not a property of a specific test. However, we can think about it as the appropriateness of its use and when we're interpreting the data in the administration of test. So things we want to ensure that test is measuring what it's supposed to measure, it's using the right language, it's using the right domains and facets of the certain construct, that this construct is very closely related, this tool is very closely related to the other similar sort of tools, and not related to the tools that has nothing to do with the constructs we're trying to achieve or measure. And then, of course, reliability. Reliability is more technical, statistical thing that we can keep track of, and it's worth to keep an eye on. And there are a variety of different aspects of reliability. So, for example, test retest is the indicator where we're measuring something today, and we want to measure it 6 months later and ensure that the results are consistent. That child who did really, really poorly or really, really well is not having the polar opposite results 6 months later, because without any intervention, that would indicate the problem not with the child. Most likely it will be a problem with assessment, especially when we have it at numbers at scale. We can ensure the reliability through inter-rater, using different raters. So inter-rater reliability, when different assessors gaining this similar sort of results using the same tool. We can use different forms, but ensuring the results. And finally, we can reflect on the internal consistency, meaning that if we have the multiple questions within the questionnaire, or multiple items, those items are closely related to one another within the construct. So they all very consistently measuring the same thing. So when you do the average or a mean of that construct, when you're calculating, you know that all those items belong to one another, and they roughly measuring the same thing. Okay, we'll pass it to Sarah.
Great. And so now that's kind of the big picture of what we're looking for in assessments. And now we want to narrow down a little bit to talk specifically about what we're looking for in FLN assessment tools. And there are a couple of features kind of building on those general principles that are usually particularly important to us. The first is that we're looking for assessments that are standardized, that have really specific rules about how they're administered so that it's the same every time. Also looking for tools that are simple, that the enumerators don't require a great deal of training to be able to administer accurately. We want tools that are effective, meaning that they have those characteristics of validity and reliability that Ekaterina just talked about, and as well as assessments that are very sensitive to small changes. We don't want things that require a massive improvement before you start to see an improvement on the test. These assessments should be relevant, meaning that they account for the cultural and linguistic context where they're being used. We want them to be affordable enough to be used. And when we're talking about literacy and numeracy at the foundational level, they shouldn't assume that students are already literate, because that's what we want to find out. And so for the rest of this time, we're going to talk about two specific assessment frameworks that have been used extensively all over the world to measure foundational literacy and numeracy. The first is the early grade reading and math assessment, which are examples of curriculum-based measures. And this type of assessment was first developed in the 1970s at the University of Minnesota. And the idea was to give classroom teachers a tool that could help them make accurate instructional decisions using mostly materials that they already had in their own classroom. And then around 2006, the early grade reading and math assessments were developed using a very similar framework. But now, instead of just being used for instructional decision-making, they were being used to do system diagnostics as well as for program evaluation. And this map shows just some of the places that EGRA and EGMA tests have been administered. A different assessment framework that has a different history is the USER framework. And it goes by many different names in different countries, but was first developed by Pratham for two purposes. One, to put students into groups for their TARL programming, as well as to do citizen-led assessments. And the idea here was to create an assessment framework that was easy enough for ordinary citizens to administer, as well as something that could be really easily adapted for multiple languages. There are several other assessment frameworks or types of assessments that are sometimes used to measure foundational literacy and numeracy, but they have some limitations, and that's why we're not going to discuss them today. But I've got links here if it's something that you want to read more about and see if it's something that could be useful for you. Usman at the offsite talked about PAL Network's work in creating common assessments that are fully aligned with the Global Proficiency Framework. So iCare and iCan, and those haven't been released yet, but they should be available by around the middle of this year. So if it's something that you're interested in, definitely reach out to PAL Network or let us know, and we'd be happy to connect you with them. There are also some pretty significant modifications to EGRA and EGMA to make them easier to administer, either group administered or self-administered using a tablet. And because the evidence about the validity of these tools is still being established, it's something that if you're interested in looking in, you would really need to do some research to see if in your setting there is enough evidence to support their use. There are also computerized adaptive tests where students sit at a computer or a tablet and they answer usually multiple choice questions, sometimes spelling questions, and then they get progressively easier or more difficult questions depending on their performance. For the most part, the computerized adaptive tests that are either free or open source haven't been validated yet. But of course, all of these areas are, there's active research going on and may very well change in the coming years. And we're also not talking about national or international assessments because for the most part, these are written assessments. And so that's something that's going to come after these FLN assessments. So now to go back to EGRA-EGMA and the USER frameworks to connect it to what Ekaterina was explaining about validity and reliability. This is what we mean when we say that these frameworks are technically adequate. EGRA and EGMA were, or the basis of them was developed in the US, where they were found to be highly correlated with gold standard reading and math assessments, including the ones listed here. So these are very comprehensive assessments that usually take 45 minutes to an hour to administer, but they found that using this format was able to predict those scores really well. And then in some low and middle income countries, they've done studies looking at how EGRA scores correlate with written national exams. And in general, they found moderate concurrent validity, which is basically what you would expect because national exams usually require knowledge of other content outside of FLN. So that's what you would really expect from a good FLN assessment, is that kind of moderate level of validity. In general, EGRA and EGMA assessments that follow this framework have high internal consistency. If you look at subtests within a single test, they tend to be highly correlated. So for example, the different reading subtests, if a student scores very highly on one, they tend to score very highly on the others as well. And you also see a moderate to low correlation between EGRA and EGMA, which is, again, what you would hope, because some students may be stronger at reading, some may be stronger at math, and so you wouldn't expect a perfect correlation of those assessment scores. This is all talking about these assessments broadly. You can measure the psychometric properties of specific test forms on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes you can find those published. But in general, what we can say is that if you follow the rules of creating these assessments, you're likely to create a technically adequate tool. USER has been primarily validated based on its concurrent validity with EGRA, meaning that when you administer both of them to the same students, they either tend to score highly on both or poorly on both. Because of the kind of data that you get from USER assessments, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, a lot of these tests of validity actually can't be conducted. It's just not possible given the kind of data that you get. So that's not a strike against it as a test, but it's just a limitation that a lot of times you actually can't conduct validity tests on specific test forms in the same way that you can with EGRA and EGMA. And to sum it up, both of these kinds of tests have been used extensively across the world. So there aren't geographic restrictions to using one versus the other. But if you're looking for comparable data to be able to say, this is what our program did and this is what others have done, you may need to check to see what kind of data is available in your country, in your language, so that you're able to get that comparable information. And basically, what we can't say about these formats is that if you use them, you'll automatically get valid and reliable tools. But what we can say is that based on research conducted in many different countries, using this format consistently gives us tools that are highly technically adequate. And particularly if it's a very high stakes administration for a program evaluation or something like that, you can measure the psychometric qualities of individual test forms either during piloting or during implementation. And so now we'll dive in a little bit into the more specific features of these two assessments and things that make them similar and things that make them different. They're delivered in very similar ways. It's individual one-on-one with an assessor and oral. You can record the results paper and pencil or using an app. They're both criterion referenced, meaning that you're measuring students against a score or a benchmark, not specifically against each other. You get very different kind of data from these two types of assessments. EGRA and EGMA give you raw scores for each subtest, whereas with USER, you just get a level on a scale. A child could be proficient with letters or proficient with words, according to the different levels that are there. EGRA and EGMA are timed, so you get precision data and fluency data, connecting back to the Global Proficiency Framework. With USSER, since it's not timed, you only get precision data. EGRA and EGMA are not adaptive, so students, no matter how they perform on one subtest, they go on to take the rest of the subtests. But USSER is adaptive, meaning that they'll only take the more difficult, do the more difficult tasks if they've demonstrated mastery with the easier ones. There are core and optional subtests for EGRA. The core ones include listening comprehension, identifying letters, reading non-words, reading passages, as well as answering reading comprehension questions. But in addition to that, depending on features of different languages or the kind of data that you're looking for, there can be additional subtests that are added. EGMA is a lot more standardized. You tend to see the same subtests across most administrations. 3 related to number knowledge, so identifying, discriminating, and finding missing numbers, and then moving into operations and word problems. This is an example of a letter sound knowledge subtest from an EGRA assessment. So the assessor presents the student with this grid of letters, and then they ask them to read as many as they can in 1 minute and record the number of letters that they correctly identified in 1 minute. And mapping it onto the Global Proficiency Framework, if you administer all of the core elements of an EGRA test, that's going to cover all of the areas of the Global Proficiency Framework. And like Ekaterina said, we're not saying that the Global Proficiency Framework is something that you have to use, but however you're defining foundational learning within your organization, it's important to map the assessments you're using on that to see if it's covering everything that matters to you. This is an EGMA example. So again, the assessor presents the stimulus to the students. In this case, it would be this box with the numbers and asks them to identify numbers for 1 minute, and you record how many they can identify in 1 minute. Compared to EGRA, EGMA covers a much smaller subset of the Global Proficiency Framework. Only number knowledge. And the rationale for that is that number knowledge is foundational to all of these other categories in a way that the others are not foundational. So if you don't have number knowledge, you're not going to be able to complete measurement, statistics, geometry, or algebra tasks. Whereas if you're missing geometry skills, you might still be able to do some of the other ones. However, the PAL Network common assessments are going to be fully aligned with this. So if you are interested in measuring some of these other areas, that might be a tool to consider using once it's available. USSER tests have a smaller number of subsections. So for literacy, the core areas are letter recognition, word reading, paragraph reading, and story reading. In some cases, you'll see comprehension questions, but they're not a core part of the original assessment. For numeracy, there are also 4 levels, recognizing single-digit, double-digit numbers, subtraction, and division. And the rationale for those is that if a child can subtract, they can probably add. If the child can do division, they can probably do multiplication. But in some cases, you will see examples of addition and multiplication being added as additional subtests. This is an example of a reading test. So you can see you have these 4 these 4 sections beginning with letters and going up to stories. In some cases, you'll start with the easiest and then just move up if the child is successful at the easier levels. In other versions, you start at a mid-difficulty task and then go down or up. But it's just important to be consistent and follow the administration guidelines for the exact form that you're using. Compared to EGRA, USSER covers a much smaller subset of the Global Proficiency Framework areas. So you're only really getting precision data under decoding, and you're not getting any language comprehension, reading comprehension, or fluency data unless you add additional subtests. The math form looks quite similar. And again, in some cases, you'll start at the easiest and move up, or start in the middle and then move up or down based on student performance. And again, that just depends on the exact form you're using and what the instructions are there. Similarly to EGMA, USER only covers the number knowledge strand within the Global Proficiency Framework. And unless you add real-world problems as an additional subtest, it wouldn't cover that. So again, just a smaller subset of that framework. So in summary, comparing these two assessment frameworks, EGRA and EGMA require more time, still not nearly as much time as some of the, these gold standard reading and math tests that take an hour to administer, but still somewhat more. They require more enumerator training, and you need more complex data collection systems, including some way to time the subtest. As a trade-off, you get fluency data, which aligns with the Global Proficiency Framework, tends to be a better predictor of comprehension, and particularly in languages with transparent orthographies, where there's a really close one-to-one relationship with letters and sounds, fluency data can help you reduce ceiling effects. EGRA and EGMA also tend to be more sensitive to very small changes. The amount of improvement that a child has to have to get from 13 correct words per minute to 14 correct words per minute is much smaller than the amount of change it takes for them to go from being proficient with letters to proficient with words. So if you're talking about short timelines, then that can be a real benefit of the EGRA and EGMA framework. You also get data that you can just do more with statistically. You can compare means, you can get better evidence of validity of specific test forms, and in general, you're going to have fewer ceiling and floor issues where many students get a 0 score or many students get the highest score, and then it doesn't help you distinguish between who's doing well and who's not doing well. And this is a great summary from a study done in India where they administered USER and an EGRA-like test to the same group of students, and found that the scores were highly correlated. And they summarized that deciding which test to use should be based on the purpose of testing and the kind of information that you need. So that is kind of our main content, and we want to spend most of the rest of the time allowing you to talk to each other about the kinds of assessments that you use, what's working well for you, maybe any challenges that you're experiencing. And then we'd love for you just to think about that in terms of what we've just talked about, in terms of validity and reliability, and maybe how that has impacted the way that you choose and conduct these assessments. So before we do that, I'll share these questions in the chat. But before we do that, does anyone have any burning questions or things that you'd like to discuss or ask the whole group related to what we've talked about so far? Yeah, Victoria?
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I'm just trying to understand now the difference with with ICANN and ICARE coming up, you said at the end of the or like mid-year. In between those now, comparing those to EGMA and EGRA, what do you see as the key benefits or differences there? I haven't fully understood that yet, because from the GSF offsite, when talking to the person who was there, he sold it, or like he told about, I left it with like, oh man, this I have to wait for this. This is gonna be amazing. So just wanted to get a bit of a sense from your side. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Since it's not available yet, we weren't able to review it or do any kind of, very robust comparison with the other tools. I'm not 100% sure about the format of the test or how it'll be administered, whether it's orally, whether there are multiple choice questions. I'm just not sure, and so I just don't think they've released that information yet. But once it is available, we'd be very happy to kind of pull some more of that information into this presentation and reshare it. But I'm also very excited about it and looking forward to seeing how that progresses.
One question from my side. So suppose like we are using kind of not any of the standardized EGRA or EGMA kind of a test. We are developing our own assessment. Yeah. So So when you are looking at if you want to measure and ensure that it's valid and reliable, the assessment is valid and reliable, should we necessarily go through all the criteria, like see that the test passes all the criteria, or is there any kind of a standard that maybe phase and construct validity would be enough, or Cron-Bash alpha, maybe to what extent, what is a kind of a cutoff for Cron-Bash alpha, which will tell us like, yeah, this is kind of reliable. So how do we go about that?
Excellent question. Should I start, Sarah, and you jump in? So in principle, you would want to make sure that everything we talked about at the beginning about validity and reliability is tested for your assessment. And the way you do it, you separate those two things. You concentrate on your reliability, starting with Cron-Bash alpha. Internal reliability is important, but there is also test-retest that is super easy to administer, super easy to gather data, and very informative as well. It depends on the assessment tool you have as well. So in some cases, inter-rater reliability is very helpful as well. And what it does, it gives you different perspectives. So for example, if you have different for developing observation schemes, inter-rater reliability absolutely must. If you're developing a pen and paper tool, then it would be least effective. So for reliability, as a bare minimum, you need to have internal consistency, and test-retest. For the validity, ideally, you would go across all of them. Face validity and content validity is super easy. It's almost as reading against the key construct descriptions and making sure that the wording and phrasing is useful and clear and aligned with age and level of comprehension of the students you're going to administer it with. As for the construct, validity is a little bit more complex, but it's absolutely must, because if your tool measuring not what it's supposed to measure, then what's the point of that data? What's the point of investing all the time and energy into it, right? So having that assessment done and ensuring that your data is good as any other assessment tool would be really essential. So I would say that in terms of the validity, most of those items needs to be checked off. In terms of the reliability, it depends on the tool. At least 2 needs to be done for the test-retest and for the internal consistency. Sarah, please jump in.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is, and we'll share the links to this, but the EGRA and the EGMA toolkit have really good descriptions of how they measure those things when they're developing new test forms. And even if you're not using that format, the same principles still apply. So it really gives a pretty descriptive, almost guidebook about how to validate a new test form, even if it's not that format. So we'll be happy to share those as well.
One more thing in developing the assessments thing to consider is developmental norms. So it's not just the key developmental milestones, but also you may want to reflect on the expected level of comprehension, language abilities, and so on. And as well as if you're just the last thing, otherwise it sounds very overwhelming, but also think about who is administering your tool. So when you're creating a new tool, then you need to think about both sides. Who is it for? And test the validity and reliability, as well as who is doing it. And then any sort of testing around, piloting around the instructions, their comprehension skills, their ability to administer it. Because if it hasn't been administered correctly, as good as tool is, it may not provide you with the best results or accurate results. Okay, I finished now. I think I finished now. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming.
No, thanks. That's clear.
I think actually before going into the breakout rooms, we'll take our quick break. So it's 56 after now. So I think if we take 10 minutes, we can come back at 6 minutes after the hour, and then we'll jump right into the breakout rooms and worksheets. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. All right, welcome. We were able to pop into some of the rooms, and it was just really great to hear everyone's thinking around how you're measuring learning outcomes and the diversity of different experiences, as well as some common threads across everyone. Would someone from group 1 like to share maybe some highlights of what you talked about, if there were any themes that came up or common challenges?
Just wasn't clear to me which was group 1 or whether we were in group 1.
Exactly.
Others experienced that.
Sorry, I guess the numbers got messed up when we sent the groups the wrong way. Okay, then how about Simon's group? Whoever's
Okay.
speaking from that group.
Yeah, hi. So we got to see little snapshots of how early grade reading assessments are being managed in different ways, and we shared how oral reading fluency assessment works. We talked a bit about comparability of assessments across grades, and we heard about how Axiom uses Tangerine. So one of the kind of things that emerged to me was there's a question as to, do you try and assess all children and make this part of your program, or do you instead have sampling done of some children and see this as evaluation? So is getting learning data a core aspect of program implementation, or is it a kind of dipstick thing that you do? There are pros and cons, but yeah, that's one of the things that we left with more to think of when the time ended.
Yeah, absolutely, because it really gets at the kind of question of, why are you assessing learning outcomes? Is it because you need that data for each student to be able to group them appropriately, or, you know, provide instruction in some kind of way? Is that going back to the teachers so that they can decide how to support students better? Or, like you said, is it more about understanding if your program's working on the whole? And that makes a big difference for how and when you're going to collect the data. Really good point. I'll just go in order. Victoria, were you in the same group or a different group?
Different group.
Okay, someone from Victoria's group want to share?
Yeah, I can share briefly. It was mostly Chloe and I started to share because we thought we had abundant time, and so unfortunately, Craig and Anim haven't yet shared. But we mostly talked about, I think, the challenges. I mean, various challenges around how much sort of just time intensity there is when it comes to assessments, and the questions of the disruption of learning that happens while tests are being done, as well as Chloe shared about their learnings from upskilling teachers in how to interpret the data, and so they really need to understand it, especially sort of when an intervention starts, that obviously the data, the results are taking their time to show the effect. We also talked about one of our challenges sort of is in terms of the time, especially that, like, the qualitative comments that teachers put into their assessments often take a lot of time beyond just then the quantitative assessments. And Chloe shared that that their learning was that there is that the sort of the impact or the value of those qualitative comments is often not as big, versus rather having a much more sort of multiple choice, sort of dualistic answer for teachers, and then have suggested activities what parents can do at the back of the report cards, which we found very interesting. Maybe just a couple of those challenges and how different organizations have solved them. Chloe, you want to add anything? Or of course, Craig and Anim.
I think you summarized it really well. Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks so much. In the interest of time, because we still have one more activity, we're going to go ahead and move on. But if there were any other really key insights or questions that were remaining after your conversation, feel free to put them in the chat and we can come back to them at the reflection at the end. So thank you all so much for your insights and sharing. We really appreciate it. share my screen again. Here we go. So many of you are, already have the tools that you need to assess learning outcomes in a way that suits your needs. But if you are looking for new tools or looking to expand your repertoire or add anything to your current assessment practices, we've put together some resources that might be helpful as you get started with that process. In some cases, depending on the country you're in, the language that you're using, there may be test forms that are already available for free for you to use. So the Early Grade Reading Barometer website has a lot of examples of EGRA assessments. I think the website is offline now, but I've linked an archived version here that hopefully would help you access that content if you need it. Save the Children has a lot of test forms across formats. They have EGRA and EGMA tests, USER tests. Their Literacy and Numeracy Boost program has its own assessment. It's very similar to EGRA and EGMA, but has some additional subtasks, especially for math, if you're interested in getting at some of those other categories in the Global Proficiency Framework. These aren't available online, but the team does have them, and they've said that they're willing to work with labs organizations to share them. So if this is something you're interested in, please reach out and we'd be happy to connect you. Schools 2030 also has some test forms available on their website, and I've got the link here. For the most part, these follow the USER format. They're also really detailed descriptions of how to modify and field test existing forms. So if you have a form and you need to make, for example, equivalent forms or slightly adjust it for different contexts, there are steps that you can follow to do that and then to field test it. I've linked those here. And then there's also, you may be in a situation where you realize that you need to develop new test forms, whether you have the capacity to do that internally or to work with external partners to do that. So there's some consultancy firms that specifically specialize in helping organizations develop a bank of test forms that they can use. So that could be an option if that's something that, that you're looking for or that you need. One kind of really crucial point here is that the reason that you might need multiple test forms is largely due to practice effects, which means that student scores improve when they take the same test multiple times, even if they haven't learned anything new in the interim, just because they're familiar with the test questions. And so there are basically two ways to get around this. One is to do cross-sectional sampling, where you have different students taking the assessment at different points in time. And then if you do this, obviously test security is important so that the test wouldn't leak out and other people wouldn't have access to it before your end line. Another option is to create multiple equivalent forms of a test. So you need to demonstrate that these forms are equally difficult for a representative sample of target students. Typically, this process would start with expert judgment, maybe supplemented with readability formulas to create test forms that look similar, seem similar. But even, and that should be based on what you know about the language's phonological structures, syntactic structures. So really bringing in everything you know about the language and about the students to try to make these as equivalent as possible. But even after doing that, you can still end up with form effects. Either because of form level factors, which could be things like maybe the words you in one of those forms are less common in the language, or the words are less decodable, or the sentence structure is a little bit different. And you might also have student level factors. So some students might have background knowledge about one thing versus another thing, or might have different vocabulary knowledge. So field testing these different test forms with a representative sample of students is really the only way. There's no readability formula. Only your students are going to be able to tell you what's easy and what's difficult. And so typically in that field testing, you would administer multiple forms to the same students, and then you would eliminate forms that are either unusually easy or unusually difficult. It's also possible, but not preferred, to do statistical equating after administration, but more details about all of these steps. This is just to give a sense of some of the issues that can come up when you're needing multiple forms of a test, but really detailed instructions about all of these things are in the EGRA and EGMA toolkits, which we'll share. Another point is thinking about accessibility for children with disabilities and specifically sensory disabilities. If you are aware of children who are participating in your program who are blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, there are steps that you can take to make the assessments that you're already using accessible to those children. Typically for students who are blind or low vision, you would start with an existing validated test form and create large print and braille adaptations. You may not be able to compare their fluency data with the fluency data of other students because typically tactile reading just takes longer than visual reading, but it tends to be a pretty straightforward process. For children who are deaf or hard of hearing, there are a lot more considerations to take into account that would probably need to be discussed with local disability experts. You might need to remove, add, or adapt some types of tasks. In general, reliability has improved a lot when assessors have recorded video as opposed to giving instructions directly to students, as well as recording videos of students' responses and scoring them later. But there are more details about this in from TUSOME, as well as some projects in Morocco and Cambodia. The Morocco one in particular was very strong and started with really strong engagement with the disability community in Morocco. So if that's something you're interested in, those are great resources to get started. And the last topic that we're going to go through is about how to interpret and communicate results that you get from these types of assessments. Just a disclaimer, everything we've put in here is just for examples. And if you're doing these assessments in your context, you'll need to do your own research to make sure that the benchmarks and the things that you're using are the best for the students that you're working with. There are a number of different types of indicators that we can get from reading and math assessments. These are all examples from the primer project, which was the RCT that preceded TUSOME in Kenya, as well as the national rollout. So these are all reading indicator examples, but you could have similar ones for math. So the first type of indicator would be a benchmark indicator. So an example of this would be the percentage of learners who attain minimum grade level proficiency. And so for the purposes of this project, the proficiency or the benchmark was established for English, 65 correct words per minute, Swahili, it was for 45 words per minute. And then what you're able to do is look at the percentage of children at that benchmark over time and compare, baseline, midline, end line. So you can see examples of those percentages there. A different type of indicator is looking at the percentage of children who have improved by at least one level. So USSER-like assessments are really good for this, but you can do it with EGRA and EGMA as well. So an indicator would be the percentage of children who have improved reading skills. And so as part of the remedial reading program, 67.1% of students improved by at least one level. Another type of indicator is zero reduction. We know that in many cases we're working with students who are quite far below grade level and below the literacy and math levels that we'd hope to see. So it can be an accomplishment even to move students from 0 to 1, whatever that is in the context of the assessment. So in this case, for grade 1 learners at the beginning, 53% of grade 1 learners couldn't read a single word. And by the end, only 23% couldn't read a word. And then the last kind is mean comparison. So you're looking at a control group and an experimental group or something like that, and you're comparing the differences in the means. And so for grade 1 English in non-formal schools, the students who participated in the program grew by 19 more correct words per minute than the control group did. And if you're reporting mean comparison, it's also a good practice to report your p-value and your effect size. And I just bring this up because even when you administer an assessment, different organizations could administer the same assessment and share their results in really different ways. And each of these kinds of indicators gives you kind of a different view of how children have progressed while they're in your program. Depending on the kind of assessment you use, how often you administer the assessment, whether you're doing it as part of your general monitoring or as part of an experiment where you have a control group, all of those factors can influence which types of indicators you choose to use. But just to be aware that there are a lot of different options out there, and you can see what makes the most sense for your program. But in particular, for the monitoring requirements for the lab, we're asking you to report against a benchmark. So the indicator that we're asking you to report against is the percentage of children who are achieving good learning outcomes, meaning the percentage who are performing at a certain benchmark. Depending on your setting, sometimes benchmarks are developed at a country level, could be part of a project, sometimes it's institutionalized by the government, and they can come from a really wide variety of sources, whether it's curriculum alignment, expert opinion, benchmarking studies, or even project implementation data. A lot of times one benchmark is then used to develop other benchmarks. So for the most part, these oral reading fluency benchmarks that we have come from working backwards from children who answer 80% of comprehension questions correctly. So you're assuming that if they're getting 4 out of 5 comprehension questions correctly, they're reading well enough to support comprehension, and you set the oral reading fluency benchmark based on that. But in summary, benchmarks can vary a lot across languages, across countries. But having said that, there's a lot of data in most settings to be able to select reasonable and defensible benchmarks in most contexts. So there might not be a perfect answer. The government of the country you're working in may or may not have this in their national curriculum, but there have been a lot of these benchmarking studies done and a lot of this work done. So it's generally possible to find one that makes sense. The benchmarks for us are actually pretty standard. Typically for reading, if they can read the paragraph, that's considered proficient for grade 1. If they can read the story, that's considered proficient for grade 2. And then the same for math. For EGRA and EGMA, you're usually looking at subtest scores. For EGRA, usually oral reading fluency is the primary measure, and then other subtests provide supporting evidence. It's not really recommended to calculate composite scores. For EGMA, you can calculate a composite score. So I've linked the article with instructions about considerations if you're interested in calculating a composite score. And just one final point about benchmarks. That there really is not always a perfect answer, but understanding your context and what exists can help you communicate your results in a way that's going to be comparable to how other people are reporting in your context. So you can see this isn't even across languages. This is just for English, and these are benchmarks that have been established in different countries. And in some cases, this is just one benchmark among many that has been established in the country. So, and then if you look at the graph, you can see they vary quite a lot. In some cases, you've got benchmarks for every grade level. In other cases, you might only have one benchmark for all of early primary, or all of the whatever point you're developing foundational literacy and numeracy skills. And so again, it's not about finding necessarily a perfect answer, but it's about critically reviewing the literature, thinking about what's available in your setting, and making an informed choice based on that. And while another challenge can be, if we only have one benchmark, how do we work backwards to know what should a first grader be able to do? What should a second grader be able to do? But again, there has been a lot of research done in this area to get a sense of how reading levels progress over time. So you might be able to use your own data from similar innovations, or even just general progress monitoring literature to make informed choices. And so for the rest of the time, the next few minutes, we're going to share a worksheet that is going to help you document your plan for monitoring learning outcomes as part of the Impact at Scale Labs. It pulls from a lot of the content that we've gone over today about what makes a test valid, what makes a test reliable. And so really what we want you to do is make a case for the assessment that you plan to use, to explain to us how you're going to implement it, and why that makes sense for your context. So this will be part of the monitoring requirements for the lab, and you'll be essentially following this plan when you submit your monitoring reports. So I think the worksheet is was shared with you by email ahead of time. I will also put I'll also put a copy in the chat in case you weren't able to answer it. Does anyone have any questions about that before we go into rooms by organization?
I have done a question on the chat actually, Sarah. Maybe we can take it later as well. Like,
oh yeah, yes, and actually I did write a response to this. So maybe I can just paste the response in the chat, and then we can follow up and maybe talk about it a little bit more.
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Great. So we'll go ahead and send you to your groups just to take a look at that worksheet. I know we don't have enough time to really complete it now, but just to look through it and see if you have any questions for us before we leave you to do it independently. Actually, sorry, on second thought, let me just go ahead and pull up the worksheet that you got on email, and then I'll share my screen and go through it briefly, and then just let me know if you have any questions. Or just let me know if you don't have access to it. So this is what the worksheet looks like. First, we're just asking you to let us know the name of the assessment tool, if there's a link to it, and some basic information about who the assessment tool, which ages and grades you're using it with, and how it's being administered. Then we're asking about the alignment with international learning standards. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be the global proficiency framework. That's just an example, but we just like to know how, according to what framework was this designed, and then provide some examples of whether or how it assesses grade or age level appropriate skills. And then just a brief explanation of how the tool connects to the competencies that your program targets. So this is what Ekaterina mentioned about making sure that your resources and your activities and your assessment are aligned. Then we'd like to know about any information you can share about the validation of the tool, according to all those different categories of validity that we went through. If you can explain that, as well as if you have any reliability metrics that have been published related to the tool. And then the last question is about benchmarks. Is there any data out there to support specific benchmarks, performance thresholds that can help you let us know how many children are achieving good learning outcomes? The next section is about practicality. So understanding how long it takes to administer it, what kind of training is required, the data collection systems, what your plan is to address those practice effects. So we'll use cross-sectional sampling. Are you going to have multiple equivalent forms, and any other challenges that you anticipate when administering the assessment. And then the last section is about, again, back to the benchmark. How are you going to calculate that percentage? Any plans for disaggregating the data by subgroup, and what your sampling plan is. Are you assessing all the students you work with? Are you just assessing some of them, and what's your plan for that? And then there's space at the bottom to attach any supporting documents that can give us more information about this assessment. And our goal here is really just to support you to choose assessments that are going to be useful to you now as well as in the future, both for your internal learning about the program as well as being able to communicate in language that other people around you are using in relation to national benchmarks and the kinds of indicators that are commonly reported for FLN. Does anyone have any questions about either the worksheet, or we'll just open it up to anything else that we've talked about today? Okay, great. Then, oh, go ahead.
No, just a logistical question. When do you need this worksheet back by?
End of May at the latest. So May 31st. But if you're able to share it with us sooner, especially if you already have a tool that you're comfortable using, that would be great. And we can just go ahead and get that checked off as a milestone.
Excuse me. Inspiring teachers are to do our assessment in June. We hope to end by the end of June. So in that case, can we shift us a bit so that we can have actual data as to the assessment instrument and how far learners performed, etc.?
It's a good question. If you can just let us know your plan in that document, and if it's something that's coming up soon, if you can just share that with us as soon as possible so we can just make sure we're all in alignment about timelines, that would be great.
All right. Thank you.
Would anyone like to share one thing that you are going to take away from this session? Maybe something that you learned from your peers in the small groups, either one thing you learned or one thing that you might want to try differently after today?
Can I go? Okay. Yeah. So one thing I'm taking away is that I will be exploring how to measure reliability, especially using Cronbach alpha. Yeah, that's the one thing we are not doing right now. So we'll be doing that, and also looking at the validity criteria, and how valid and label are our the items, the assessments which we use in various grade levels. Yeah, that's one takeaway.
Great.
We've spent a lot of time thinking about scaling our kind of coaching and training and how that scales. And I think what I'm taking away from today is we currently sample every learner on EGRA, and that's very time consuming. And I think part of the scaling might be doing a sampling kind of technique for that. Yeah.
I mean, one of the takeaways for me is that I think we have to test every learner in our model. And I think I was always, thinking about like what are more efficient sort of ways of doing this assessment. But I think the session today helped me just to ground myself in like, it is just time consuming to do it well. But I think then and I think our breakout session helped me is like, how do you then rather work with this as a baseline, but then make the surrounding variables sort of better in terms of like teacher training around it, or in terms of how much sort of do you do qualitatively versus quantitatively, what are the conditions that you create. So basically just like grounding and like, okay, this is just what it takes. And maybe over time there will be different, less time consuming ways, but what we can control is sort of the surrounding settings. So that was helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, Nasifa?
For me, it's just I learned the difference and or what is validity as well as what is reliability. It's new terms for me, and what do they mean and how to go about checking on them on the program. Yes.
Great, thanks so much. We have a poll to share, just to share a little bit about how the session was for you and anything that we can improve next time. So I've just put that in the chat. If you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to fill that out before you log off. But otherwise, we are really looking forward to continuing to work with you through the MEL track of the labs. Please feel free to reach out to us to set up a coaching session if you want to talk specifically about your learning assessment. We'd be happy to either try to answer the questions or connect you with people who might be able to give you some helpful answers. So please do let us know if there's anything we can do to support you with this. And thank you again for coming today.
So, Sarah, the detailed deck you used today will be my major takeaway. If possible, you can share. I think it includes the major details around all the pointers, validity, reliability, and different reference materials. So maybe in future, if we want to reflect on these things or orient some other team members, so I think it will be helpful.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'll send it right away, right after this. It's ready to go. And
Thanks.
Ramesh, I had a response and it's not letting me paste it in the chat, but I'll send you an email right now. It's a great question and thanks for sending it.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.